Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 466, and it is entitled A History of Sculpture, written by Murray Sheehan. And this is part 2. Is there copyright? I believe there was copyright on this one. Let me look. Yes, copyright 1924. So this is the history of sculpture according to 1924. And we left off page 14 and a new chapter, the 4th century BC. It is not until we came to the next century that we find an authentic work from the hands of a master. But then we find a marvel, the Hermes of Praxiteles, preserved at Olympia. There is a different spirit present in the sculpture of this century, influenced no doubt by the downfall of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. We find now less of serenity than before, less of that sublime self-assurance, a more personal element. The Hermes has almost a brooding tenderness as he holds the infant Dionysus on his arm, and indeed from this time on we shall find more of emotion, of pathos, of feeling, creeping into the figures. In the work of Praxiteles, of which, besides the Hermes, we have only copies. This tendency goes no further than to express a slightly more human feeling than was true of the statues of the previous century, whereas we can only stand and wonder from afar when we see those great godlike figures from the Pantheon. We can, as it were, get closer to the work of Praxiteles, feel a warmer everyday pulse of life in them. His Venus, which was considered his masterpiece in his own time, and his Satyr both have the same personable quality, which was almost totally lacking in the supreme work of the classical age. Scopus is the second figure of the 4th century, and in him we find that depiction of emotion to which reference has already been made. He had a way of sinking the eyes under deep brows in his figures, which in itself gave an emotional expression to the heads. The lips were generally full and bowed, showing brooding or emotional depth, and a power of passion. This was something new in sculpture, beyond anything that the Egyptians, the Assyrians, or the early Greeks had done. The 5th century had pushed sculpture forward in the very noblest achievements it has ever won. Praxiteles showed delicate feelings of reverie, which one would have said were too subtle to be captured in marble. Scopus first caught passion and emotion into his figures. The mausoleum at Helicarnus, which was the tomb of a man named Mausoleus, was in part the work of Scopus, whose influence can be clearly traced in the series of bas-reliefs from the frieze now preserved in the British Museum. In these, the action is more violent than in the frieze from the Parthenon. There is more passion. The positions of the figures express still stronger emotion than hitherto. Also, it is noteworthy that the decorations of the tomb included 2 large portrait statues of Mausoleus and his wife. In the previous century, the sculptors had devoted their art to the depiction of the gods and of general types of humanity, without descending to the portrayal of this person or that. But now we find individual portraits. Of Lysippus, the 3rd name in this century, we once more, unfortunately, possess no original works, and know his statues only from copies. His best-known work is a figure called the Aporiomonis. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. An athlete scraping the sand and oil from his body after a contest, which is now in the Vatican at Rome. The proportions of this figure show a more slender man than the famous canon of Polycletus in the previous century. He has greater height than the older figure, and its popularity in 4th century Greece shows a tendency toward our own standards of the present day. The group of Niobe and her children, now in Florence, the seated Demeter in London, and the glorious winged victory of the Louvre have all been assigned to this period, although we do not know the sculptors who produced these masterpieces. Still more startling is the fact that the Venus of Milos, also in the Louvre, is by an unknown artist. To think that what is today considered perhaps our greatest piece of antique statuary is by an artist who was not sufficiently famed in his own day for his name to have come down to us bids us pause once more to consider what a wealth of untold beauty must have disappeared forever. The proportions of the Venus, exceptionally tall, would seem to indicate that she is a work of the 4th century. There remain to be mentioned the exquisite funeral monuments of this period, a form of art creation in which these Greeks have never been surpassed. Most of them show 1 or 2 figures in bas relief with only a very tender feeling of grief, what might be called a sweet melancholy. No violent passions of mourning or regret is here. They are among the loveliest things that we have inherited from antiquity. New chapter, Hellenistic Sculpture. In the later part of the 4th century BC, there lived that Macedonian prince whom we have come to know as Alexander the Great. He who longed for more worlds to conquer. In fact, he and his generals spread the Aegeus of Greek culture over Egypt and the greater part of what was then known of Asia, and with the influences of this civilization also went its developed sculpture. But its developments were not always in the classic mode of self-restraint. Not always, we have found in the 5th and the 4th centuries, and so it is that much of this later art can only be called a decadence, and is generally given the name of Hellenistic, a minor branch of the true Hellenic manifestation. Its characteristics, as we shall see, were in general the depiction of passionate and even frenzied action, overwhelming pathos, self-conscious gracefulness, and a certain tendency to precociety, which, while it frequently is charming, is not conducive to really great art. This period, extending down to Roman times, produced some works of art which have ever since been popular favorites, but the sublimity and nobility of earlier works are gone. This is a time in which artists seek effects in the extremes of expression and of refinement. I'll take a pause for a drink because I got cotton mouth. Okay. The famous group of Laocoon, now in the Vatican, can stand as typical for us of the passionate and frenzied action of which mention we made a moment ago. The old man and his 2 sons, writhing in the toils of the enfolding serpent, form an agonizing subject which could not have been depicted in the calm manner of the earlier centuries. This advance into new fields is what has led many critics to deny that the later movement was a decadence and to maintain that it was a legitimate broadening of the scope of sculpture. The same may be said for the dying Gaul of Rome, where the pathos of the man slowly succumbing to his wounds is utterly alien to antique art and more in line with what much modern art has sought to depict. Another group from the same set of sculptures, a Gaul killing himself after killing his wife, also at Rome, is manifestly the type of statue after which many 19th century sculptors molded their works. To most people it seems less alien, less forbidding than the classic severity of the works from the Parthenon. But long acquaintance and developed application yield the palm to the older works. As typical of the self-conscious gracefulness mentioned above, may be cited the well-known figure of the Apollo Belvedere, also in the Vatican. Here we have not a god of the 5th century, nor a superhuman figure of the 4th, but almost what one might call a gentleman, a cultured creature of exquisite manner, who knows his own perfection. Elegance is present here, a quality one hardly thinks of in connection with the older work. Rhythm and harmony have been pushed to the extreme, to the verge of weakness. The line between beauty and pettiness has almost been reached, a fatal confusion of ideas, as far as serious art is concerned. Precociety is seen in the overladen depiction of the great sarcophagus of Alexander, so called at Constantinople, although this work is also filled with exquisite details and remarkable spirited decorative figures. The chaste feeling of the 4th century funeral stones is lacking. However, there is a love for ostentation and display for its own sake, a show of sheer ability which seems almost vulgar when compared with earlier carving. And these characteristics are found in most of Hellenistic sculpture. These men had grown to be masters of the chisel, and they wished to display their skill. We very frequently can marvel at their work, but can worship it almost never. For that high and rare privilege, we must go back to the 2 preceding periods. Figures, gems, and coins. Although they are not all exactly in the line of our present study, there are 3 developments of Greek art which call aloud for mention before we pass on. From the Mycenaean period, about 12 or 14 centuries BC, long before the time of Homer, the peoples of the Greek peninsula had been fashioning for their delight little figures of terracotta, representing human beings, animals, etc. These reached their highest development in the great 5th century, the time of Phidias, and their manufacture attained its greatest perfection in the town of Tangria. Thus, these little statuettes are generally called Tangria figurines. They were extremely numerous, being very inexpensive, and their charm today is manifest in the thousands of specimens that have come down to us in ruins and tombs. Delicate and graceful, filled with fine movement and exquisite feeling, they are a joy to the eyes. They were made wherever Hellenic civilization spread itself, and thus we find later developments in the Hellenistic period toward more violent action and more sentimental postures. Of these later figures, Myrina in Asia Minor was the great center. Pardon me. Another very ancient development was the cutting of gems, intaglio, for use as seals. The Assyrians also had followed this practice, generally giving to their seals a cylindrical form, somewhat like a minute rolling pin, which thus gave an extended long impression, frequently very well executed. But the Greeks carried this art to an even greater degree of minute perfection, so that the finest of their work can be examined under the strongest magnifying glass. In the Hellenistic period, there arose the practice of cutting cameos for ornaments, using different colored layers for various figures. This art was further developed by the Romans and has continued into our own times. Less ancient by several centuries was the development of coins in Greece. This people was the first to strike coins from metal, which began in about the 7th century BC. Once more, it is necessary to mention the 5th century as the very acme of Greek art in beautiful coins, many of which are preserved today in museums. The same fine balance between freedom of treatment and restraint of design is present here as in the frieze of the Parthenon. A coin of these early periods, taken from almost any part of the world where Greek civilization had spread, is truly a thing of beauty and a joy forever. Next chapter. Etruscan sculpture. Before the time of the Romans, there was but little notable sculpture on the Italian peninsula. Despite the fact that this land was invaded by approximately the same tribes as Greece at about the same time, Etruria in central Italy received additional Greek elements from Asia Minor about the 10th century BC, and indeed almost her whole art development was derived from Greece and from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. This latter fact sometimes gives an oddly oriental tinge to her sculpture, as when we find almond-shaped eyes and beards and hairdresses distinctively Assyrian in type. Also, we meet with other archaic smile with that archaic smile which we found typical of some of the pristine Greek figures before the time of Phidias. But one element of Etruscan sculpture was destined to play an important part in the development of Roman statuary. This was the creation of the portrait statue. The Greeks had been more largely concerned with the depiction of gods and heroic types of men and women. The Greek portrait figures is extremely rare and never becomes characteristic, but with the Romans one might almost say that the portrait statue is the most thoroughly typical creation of their art, and in the evolution of this genre, the Etruscans were largely instrumental. Cinerary urns and sarcophagi of a particular sort are the most noteworthy of Etruscan sculptures. In these, a great use of terracotta was made, with life-size effigies of the deceased stretched out in a half-recumbent position on the lid. Very often a man and his wife are shown together, talking pleasantly. These figures were brightly colored, and despite the archaic treatment of the head, they give a vital sense of vitality. The limbs and bodies are well molded, and in later cases were filled with considerable grace. This attempt to copy the features of the dead, showing them in living postures, brought about that love of portraits which has filled our museums with thousands of Roman emperors, matrons, senators, etc. from later times. When Rome finally conquered Etruria in 283 BC, the Romans took as booty thousands of bronze statues. Those which have come down to our times from Etruscan bronze show a style inferior to Greek work, although it must be remembered that the Greeks themselves highly cherished the bronzes of Etruria and imported them in considerable numbers. The orator at Florence is perhaps the best known of this development of Etruscan art, just as the finest sarcophagi are preserved in the Louvre and in the British Museum. And I think we'll stop there. That's the end of that chapter. And this is the end of part 2. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part 3.